Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Research Center. Today it is my real pleasure, Jeffrey Knopf at Stanford. He's a professor and chair of the MA program series of studies at the Military Institute Center Studies, contributor to Deterrence, arms control, and non-proliferation. Now, Jeff received his PhD here at Stanford in Political Science Department, and he spent 2018 and 2019 as a visiting scholar at CSAC. So it is especially nice to have him back in this room. Now, Jeff's work consistently bridges careful theory, historical insight, and policy relevance, and he has a rare ability to make difficult strategic questions both precise and accessible. He's the author of numerous articles and books on deterrence and coercion, and his most recent book, Coercing Syria on Chemical Weapons, was published earlier last year by Oxford University Press as part of the Bridging Gap series. So I'm excited to read your book, but today's talk is not about chemical weapons.
Nope.
Today, Jeff will be speaking about his recent work on the limits of confidence on nuclear deterrence, and we're very much looking forward to the discussion, Jeff. So floor is yours. He's going to be talking for about 40 minutes, and after that, we'll open the floor for Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. Is the mic on? Can people hear? Good, okay. Yeah, so it's always just a real treat and a pleasure to come back to CSAC and to talk here. My first tour of duty at Stanford was long enough ago that this research center was in the old Galvez house. I was telling one of your current postdoctoral fellows that back in my day, we didn't have to walk barefoot in the snow, but the fellows were all housed in trailers that were on the building of the old Galvez house. That's long gone. It's now the nice, shiny, fancy alumni center. But I remember this campus when it wasn't quite as wealthy as it is today. So let me get started. I want to start with an acknowledgement. I wrote this paper under the auspices of the Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group. This was one of 4 working groups that was set up by the larger Rethinking Nuclear Deterrence Project funded by the MacArthur Foundation. This was something I had been thinking about for a long time, and you'll see very quickly, this is not in any way, shape, or form a traditional academic social science paper. And so I had been wrestling with how could I write this up? How could I find a context in which I could sort of pursue this line of thought, since it's not kind of the typical thing. And the Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group proved to be a sort of perfect venue for doing this. So let me get started and see if we make this work. Good. So I teach at a policy school, so we teach everybody the bluff principle. That's bottom line up front. Some of what I'm going to argue is basically premises that I put out there that are my impressions in order to kind of set up the problem I really want to talk about. But my impression is that there's not a whole lot of urgency in the world right now about trying to tackle the potential risk of nuclear war. That this is not a high priority item that people think needs to be dealt with urgently in the short term, right? And if that's true, I think there's a number of potential explanations for that. But I believe that one factor is the simple fact that the worst hasn't happened yet, right? We've now passed more than 80 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki without nuclear weapons use. And this may be giving people a certain level of comfort with the status quo in which they don't feel they really need to do anything because the bad things aren't happening. I think this is actually a very, very thin, unreliable basis of evidence for drawing an inference about our ability to move forward without nuclear weapon use. And that's the main point I want to make, that nuclear deterrence, nuclear strategy are inherently unpredictable. I'll present a number of arguments in support of that, but for me, I think the core of the paper is a novel thought experiment that I came up with. If you were persuaded by the argument, I'll sort of end with some policy implications. Okay. So I think about the last 10 years, and a lot of things have happened that could very easily have made people quite worried about the danger of nuclear war. I guess we're literally the 1-year anniversary of Trump 2.0. But if you remember those now seemingly ever more distant days of the first Trump administration, there was some fairly vigorous exchanges of rhetoric between the US and North Korea in those days, in which then President Trump was tweeting things like, North Korea will experience fire and fury like the world has never seen. And my button is bigger than his button, causing a certain amount of nuclear saber rattling. More obviously and more recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine came with a lot of veiled and not so veiled nuclear threats on the part of President Putin and other senior Russian officials. Most Americans, at least I think maybe a little bit more under the radar, just this past summer, there was a quite serious crisis between India and Pakistan after a Pakistani terrorist attack killed about 24 tourists in Indian-controlled Kashmir, and both sides flew incursions into the other side's territory, and the conventional conflict that started after that. So a lot of real-world reminders involving a lot of different dyads about flashpoints in the world that could lead to nuclear war. If you're the kind of person that doesn't follow the news, but you follow popular culture has also been popping up its own reminders. A couple years ago, we had the movie Oppenheimer, did really well around the world box office-wise, won an Academy Award. More recently, Catherine Bigelow's film, The House of Dynamite, both movies, again, kind of intended by their directors to be reminders of nuclear war. Other things that have been in the news a year ago, not the one that the poor Venezuelan opposition leader was forced to try to give away to President Trump. But if we go back 1 year before that, the Nobel Peace Prize went to an NGO that represents Japanese atomic bomb survivors. So lots of stuff's been happening that we might predict, hey, with all of these reminders that nuclear weapons are still with us and that the danger of nuclear war still exists, people, governments should be getting mobilized to do something about this. I think that hasn't happened. Right, so let me start at the state level where it's pretty obvious. All of the nuclear armed states have recently been engaged in nuclear modernization programs. China in particular is building up the size of its arsenal pretty aggressively, but the United States is also replacing all the legs of the triad. Russia's fielding all sorts of new nuclear systems. And there's no nuclear arms control talks at all. We're approximately a month away from the expiration date of the only nuclear arms control treaty that's still in force. There's no evidence that anything is going to be done to replace it. Not only are Russia and the US no longer interested in arms control, but none of the other nuclear armed states wants to get into that enterprise as well. So there's little being done at the state level that suggests fear of nuclear war or an urgency to do anything about that. I think that's equally true at the public level, right? If you look at public opinion polling in countries that ask things like, what are the most important policy problems facing your country right now? Nuclear weapons don't show up on the list. Okay, they're just absent. Right? In the United States, it would be immigration, inflation, democratic backsliding, et cetera. In most recent democratic elections, the nuclear issue hasn't come up at all. I literally don't remember hearing nuclear weapons asked about in any of the last round of US presidential debates or the major speeches by the candidates. And I'm exactly of the age where I was a college undergraduate when the nuclear freeze movement happened in this country, and there were major protests on the streets of the United States and Western Europe. There's no mass public protest movement like that today. Probably the one vehicle that existed for trying to generate publicity about and pressure around nuclear disarmament was the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted at the UN in 2017. That also seems to have more or less run out of momentum. There aren't a lot of new states signing this. There isn't a lot of publicity given to it as a potential vehicle for organizing around. But what about us? Right, what about the subject matter experts in this field? And I will say many people in this room are a very notable exception, as are many of my colleagues down in Monterey. But I don't get a sense that there's a whole lot of buzz among the academics or subject matter experts about this issue either. Some of these quotes are a bit old, but they sort of do the job. Michael Howard, who's the first one here, was probably the senior British military historian when he was alive, right? And after the end of the Cold War, he wrote, "We've become rather expert at deterrence." Frank Gavin, who's one of the most prominent American historians of the nuclear age, in the book one before his most recent one, basically said, hey, look, I've talked to a lot of people and they all tell me we know everything we need to know about nuclear weapons. We know why, right, there hasn't been a nuclear war, right? And if I was doing one of those subject matter encyclopedia articles about what's been going on in academic research about nuclear strategy for the last 10 years, I would say the single biggest trend in the field right now is a trend towards critiquing the very idea of a nuclear revolution, that this idea that nuclear weapons are somehow different and have revolutionary implications is just false. right? And if you know strategy from the time of the ancient Greeks to the present, you know everything you need to know about how to do strategy. This doesn't mean that people think a nuclear war would be okay or that they want one, but they're not worried about the development of strategy and understanding how to keep things stable and effective. All right. So if I'm correct, that despite real world developments that might make people concerned about nuclear war, that there's not much concern, why might that be? And I think there's a number of contributing factors. One is that, unlike my undergraduate years, there's a lot of competing concerns right on the agenda right now. If I was a 20-year-old today, I don't know what I would, politically inclined to be politically active 20-year-old. I don't know what I would work on. Maybe it would be climate change is really the big existential threat we need to think about. But also a lot of short-term emergencies. Just in the United States in the last 5-6 years, you had the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. You had many people who got very agitated over the war in Gaza. Back to Minneapolis more recently, we've had the murder of Renee Good, which is again bringing people out into the streets. There's only so much time in the day and so much attention people can pay to issues, and the nuclear issue seems to be getting buried beneath some of these other issues. At the state level, the focus, I think, has really been on the return of great power geopolitical competition. And so, in Washington, D.C., to the extent that these issues get talked about, what everybody talks about is what variously gets called the three-body problem or the two-peer competitor problem. Right? So the discussion is not like, hey, what do we do to lower the temperature and reduce the risk of nuclear war? The question is, does the United States have to build up even more to have an arsenal that equals Russia plus China combined? I think another factor is that many people probably don't think they can make a difference. Right? Nuclear weapons issues are the highest of high politics, run by a nuclear priesthood. Ordinary citizens, I think, could easily despair that their efforts wouldn't matter much. I think all those things are true, by the way. But my intuition is that in addition to these things, another factor that's going on is the simple fact that we haven't had a nuclear war yet. Right? I mean, if you think about it, it's a little bit like the old children's stories of Chicken Little or The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Many of us in this room, depending on our ages, have been sounding the alarm for 10, 20, 30, 40. I don't want to age anybody, much more than that, 50 years. But saying like, hey, this could happen. It's almost certainly going to happen. Things are getting worse. Things are getting more dangerous. And fortunately for all of us, our predictions have not come true. But after a while, you start to acclimatize to that. And so people, tend to be linear thinkers, right? We tend to take recent trends and we project them into the future. And if the trend is we never have a nuclear war, right, it becomes possible to think that that's going to last for a long time. There's a little bit of evidence in support of this. Matthew Rendell had a nice article a few years ago in which he looked at some of the public opinion polling literature, right? And he found that there are some polls that ask people about what, do they think that we can go forever without a nuclear war? And people say no. At some point in the future, nuclear war is an inevitability. But then you ask them when, and they say, well, no time soon. It's not imminent. Some future generation is going to sort of blow us all up. But right now, I'm more concerned about pocketbook issues because I don't think this is going to happen in the near term. So that's my target, right, in this paper. I don't think that we should have any confidence in this. Right? That the fact that we've made it for 80 years so far tells us remarkably little about what the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years will hold. All right. And the reasons for this are actually very basic reasons. They're fundamental issues in all decision making. This is an area of high uncertainty, very tough trade-offs. And also those two problems interact with each other. They affect each other. And they do so, although they're not unique to nuclear weapons, I think the way in which these problems manifest is unusual, is distinctive when it comes to nuclear strategy. So let me see if I can get this to work. So obviously that's a clip from the movie Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist at the Manhattan Project, William Murphy, is having a conversation with General Leslie Groves, the military overseer of the bomb project, played by Matt Damon. I have no idea if that actual dialogue ever happened, but the thing they're referring to is 100% true. In summer of 1942, Edward Teller did some calculations, came to a realization that there was at least a hypothetical risk. Remember, no nuclear bomb had been detonated at this point. This is prior to the Trinity test. There was a hypothetical risk that the atomic detonation would generate so much heat that it would light set nearby parts of the atmosphere on fire. And if the heat was high enough, that fire would continue potentially until it burned up the entire Earth's atmosphere. And at the far extreme, maybe also boil off the oceans off of the Earth. So if that had happened, obviously we wouldn't be here today having this talk. All life on Earth would have been killed. When Oppenheimer was briefed on this, he was sufficiently concerned that he decided to go consult with another leading scientist at the time. In the movie, they show Oppenheimer going to meet with Albert Einstein, which is historically inaccurate. Christopher Nolan, the director, said he showed it as Einstein because all the people in the audience would know who Einstein was. Actually, Oppenheimer went to meet with Arthur Compton, who was also a very leading theoretical physicist at the time. And many, many years later, Compton wrote down his memories of what had happened at this time, and it's very illuminating. He said that he had been told that the chances of this happening were somewhat less than 3 in 1 million. So he was given a hard number. And apparently there was research after that by the scientists to put the number even lower. And that's the sort of near zero that Oppenheimer talks about. It was low enough that the scientists in the Manhattan Project decided it was safe to go ahead with this. Many people who are very anti-nuclear weapons love to invoke this incident as a metaphor for the whole nuclear age. They say, look at what's happening. The states that have nuclear weapons, the scientists that build them, they're gambling with the survival of the human race. And every time we do this, we're essentially rerunning this original experiment of, are we going to blow up the whole world? I want to use this anecdote to make a different point. The story that Compton tells about this time period is a story of what we would call risk. Right? So in the decision-making literature, this is due to a guy named Frank Knight, we make a distinction technically between risk and uncertainty. Risk is a term we use for situations in which there's sufficient data available that we can calculate the odds of things. So there's a chance that something unwanted or bad will happen, right? And we can calculate what that chance is. The whole insurance industry works on this, right? How do they set your health insurance rates? How do they set your automobile insurance rates? How do they set your homeowners insurance rates? They know the likelihood of a fire. They know the likelihood of a car crash based on various kinds of data they have. Right? Uncertainty involves situations in which there's a chance of something going bad, but we can't calculate the odds, right? There's no way to set odds. We just know there's a chance that something unwanted is going to happen, right? And I want to argue that the danger of nuclear war, although we use the word risk all the time, the risk of nuclear war, is actually a realm of uncertainty, right? And not a realm of risk, right? And in making this argument, I'm very influenced by some very senior people in our field like Janice Stein or Peter Katzenstein, who have long argued that the field of international relations as a whole has a bad habit of conflating risk and uncertainty, that when analysts in the field write about situations that involve uncertainty, they often turn them into situations of risk, because then you can attach numbers to things and they become analytically tractable. But they're really situations of uncertainty. And Scott, I know, was, I think, part of this study, and maybe some other people in the room. While I was working on this paper, the National Academy of Sciences appointed a team of high-level experts to try to apply the techniques of risk analysis to the study of nuclear strategy. And the conclusion of the study was, you can't actually do it. There's too much uncertainty here for risk. You know, there's specific small parts of the problem that you can break out and study with risk analysis, but the big picture, like what's going to lead to potential nuclear war problem, can't be studied with risk analysis because there's too much uncertainty to do the risk calculations. Yeah.
That study authorized by Jim Cooper. It was not done the way he hoped it would be and that I hoped it would be. We'd had this, and there were some members of the committee who thought it could be done. I know that for a fact, not all, but some.
All right. Well, if I'm right, I'm probably disagreeing with them,
yeah.
but you are the more expert on risk analysis than I am, Marty.
It's an area of contention.
Yeah. So let me stick with the Compton anecdote for 1 minute more, because it illustrates a second problem, which is the problem of trade-offs. Right? And when he recollected this situation many, many years later, Compton wrote, "This would be the ultimate catastrophe. Better to accept the slavery of the Nazis than to run a chance of drawing the final curtain on mankind." So I'm always a little jealous. Like, the guy was already a great physicist. Did he have to be such a good writer too? You know, it's like, I wish my students could write like that. Heck, I wish I could write like that. In the Cold War, this was sometimes sort of the better dead than red sort of argument, or are you better red than dead? right? There are trade-offs here. If nuclear weapons work to create deterrence against existential threat, they do it by creating an existential threat of their own. And we have to weigh which of these is the one that scares us more, which of these is the one we want to avoid at the potential cost of increasing the danger of the other one, right? So there are trade-offs between whether to have nuclear weapons or not, or live in a conventionally armed world only. There are also trade-offs within the realm of nuclear strategy, right? So nuclear strategy experts disagree with each other, right? Is it more important to have a margin of superiority to deter sort of deliberate, rational calculations of people looking to jump through windows of opportunity, right? Or is it more important to have measures of reassurance and confidence-building measures to reduce the chances of inadvertent escalation, right? So there are multiple trade-offs within the nuclear world. Okay, why does this matter? It matters because of the nature of nuclear strategy, well, the nature of strategy in general. Right? If a country gets nuclear weapons, it has to figure out what to do with them, right? Or at least it should be trying to figure out what to do with them, right? And we call that strategy, right? Most countries, at least in their sort of official discourse, say deterrence is the primary reason we have nuclear weapons. We have them to deter nuclear threats against us, maybe against our allies, maybe other kinds of existential threats. Well, what is strategy? Right? Strategy is a form of prediction. Right? It's a forecasting exercise. It's essentially saying, if I have the following weapons with the following kind of force posture and the following kind of doctrine for using them and the following kind of declaratory strategy to tell everybody else what I'm doing, I will get the good results that I want. My security will be protected and the worst won't happen, or at least I can minimize the chances that the worst will happen and I can maximize my chances of managing any remaining risks that there are. And if I do anything that's too radically different from my preferred strategy, it's not going to turn out as good. Okay. So all strategies are based on an effort at forecasting into the future what's going to happen. So prediction, forecasting, those are kind of the polite words for talking about it. Somewhat blunter words, we'd say it's a bet, right? It's a gamble. If you know Marty Sherwin's last book before he passed, right, leading nuclear historian, Gambling with Armageddon, right? He reviews the whole nuclear age and says it was just a whole series of gambles. Benoit Pelopidis, who spent time here back in the day as a postdoc, has a lovely article where he talks about nuclear strategy as a bet portrayed as a certainty, right? That we're making a bet, but we're expressing a very high level of confidence that our bet is going to turn out the right way, right? And are we correct to do that, right? Can we be confident in the predictions that are behind nuclear strategy choices, right? Short answer is the field itself has no consensus about this, right? Our whole discipline from 1945 to the present, so we have 80 years of very, very smart people putting a lot of effort into producing bookshelves and bookshelves worth of books and journal articles trying to figure out how do nuclear weapons work, right? And there's no agreement, right? At the high level, there's a debate between probably a majority that says we're better off keeping nuclear weapons, but a not small minority that says this is too dangerous. We have to find a path to nuclear abolition. Within the camp that sort of says, yeah, let's keep the nuclear weapons, there's an equally long-running debate about what's the best strategy to use with them, sometimes summarized as sort of the mad, right, versus nuts debate, right? Are you better, right? Does nuclear deterrence work by just maintaining a secure second strike retaliatory capability, and anything you do beyond that actually is destabilizing rather than stabilizing, right? Or does nuclear deterrence work by having a margin of superiority and usable options and being prepared to engage in nuclear warfighting? That was being argued when I was a student and still being argued today. I think that the fact of these debates is actually a piece of evidence, right? If very, very smart people in a bunch of different countries with lots and lots of training and knowledge of the past 80 years worth of literature cannot reach a consensus about what strategy will work and keep us safe, it's because there's too much uncertainty, right? The fact of the debates is itself evidence that we do not know the answers. I think maybe I'll skip this slide. That's just a little bit more detail on the literature. Okay, so let's see how might it be possible to get evidence? And I have one idea. Imagine that we had godlike powers somehow. Imagine that it was within human capacity to hit rewind and to set the Earth's clock to 1945, right, before the Trinity test in Alamogordo, right, and then hit start. And we could rerun Earth's history and rerun it again, right, and rerun it again. Right? And we could create a multiverse. Right? We could create a multiverse that has hundreds or thousands of repeated trials of Earth history since 1945, right? And across, let's for round numbers sake, let's set it at 1,000. Let's say we run 1,000 trials of Earth history. They're independent of each other. They just all start over on January 1st, 1945, right? And we see what happens. Maybe they wouldn't all turn out the same, right? Maybe there would be some subset of these 1,000 cases in which somebody sets off a nuclear weapon, right? And in some of those it escalates further, and in some of them it doesn't, right? Then we could start to generate data. What's the percentage of times in which over 80 years of nuclear history, nuclear weapons get used? What percentage of time do those escalate to large-scale civilization-destroying nuclear wars? What percentage of those are started because of a failure of credibility and because a deliberate rational actor saw a window of opportunity and jumped through it because the other side's deterrent was inadequate? What percentage of those are due to kind of fog of war, fog of crisis, misperception, accident, inadvertent escalation, right? How many de-escalate after first use? How many escalate further, right? If you wanted to, we could split the sample in two, right? We could say 500 cases, nuclear weapons have never existed, and we see what happens in a conventional world after 1945. 500 cases, the bomb exists. Are there more major wars in the conventional world? How many people do they kill relative to the number of people who might be killed, right, in a nuclear-armed world, right? If we could do that, I think we could generate data that would be sufficient to move it from an uncertainty situation to a risk situation, right? We would have something that says the probability of nuclear war over a fixed 80-year period is X%, right? And we would have data from which to make a confident calculation of those odds. But obviously we can't do that, or at least not, I don't know how to do that. We haven't developed the capacity to do that yet. We don't have that data. Are there alternatives in the paper? I run through a bunch of possible other things that we might do to get us there. I don't think any of them work. Probably the closest approximation might be to run lots and lots and lots and lots of war games. If you could develop a bunch of different scenarios, tabletop them out, do them with different players from different countries, elites, members of the public, military officers, civilian politicians, different time periods, different countries, different scenarios, right? You might eventually generate synthetic data that I think would get close to what I do in the thought experiment. But everybody who's playing these games would have lived in our world, and they would sort of have the knowledge that comes from having lived in our world, which might be different than the knowledge parameters in another world. So I think there's ways to start to approximate the thought experiment, but there's no way to get the actual data. I got more bad news. Let's say that we could do the thought experiment. It doesn't answer all the questions. So I've learned this distinction from Peter Katzenstein, but I think it's not original to him. We can differentiate what's called simple uncertainty and radical uncertainty. So simple uncertainty, there's an answer, but we don't have the data yet, right? What were the chances of nuclear war in the last 80 years? If we could run my thought experiment, we could answer that question in X percentage of cases in the multiverse where there was a nuclear war. Radical uncertainty, the question cannot be answered, and the question cannot be answered because the parameters that affect the answer are continually changing and evolving. And unfortunately, I think that's the world we live in. So even if we could tell what were the chances of nuclear weapon use from 1945 to 2025, that doesn't necessarily tell us what the next 80 years are going to look like. There's more nuclear weapon states now. Each new state that joins the club, right, changes the dynamic. We're getting new generations of leaders who have not had the socializing experience of living through some of the big crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so they may not have the same understanding or the same fear of nuclear weapon use and escalation. We're getting all sorts of new technologies coming online, right? How is artificial intelligence going to affect decision-making, command and control, nuclear security, and so forth? Other problems are emerging in the world which might have interaction effects with the stability of nuclear relationships, right? If climate change gets really bad and it has all these economic and migration effects, What will it do to tensions between countries and willingness to take risks to mitigate the effects of climate change? So we live in a world of radical uncertainty in which we can never change the calculation from an uncertainty situation to a calculable risk situation. Okay. That's not the only problem. Right? So uncertainty is probably the driving problem here, but this is also a realm of really bitter trade-offs. Now, that wouldn't matter if all the trade-offs essentially ran in only one direction. Right? So suppose that we thought about the risks and we said, well, the only way in which nuclear use might become possible would be if my deterrent threats aren't credible. Right? If that was literally the only risk, then you don't have to calculate the odds, just reduce that risk. Well, then I better do everything possible to make sure that my nuclear threats are credible. But we don't live in that world, right? Most of the debates that we have about nuclear weapon policy arise because of trade-offs, right? If you're the kind of person who really worries about deterrence failing because it's not credible enough, you make one set of recommendations. Let's build more weapons and have superiority. Let's have lower yield weapons. Let's have more plans with lots of usable options. Let's be really bellicose in our rhetoric. Let's be as aggressive and tough as possible in every crisis, because all of these things are thought to bolster credibility. But if you're the kind of person who worries about war by accident and inadvertent escalation, those are all the wrong prescriptions. Every one of those prescriptions makes the situation worse. It doesn't make it better, right? If we knew that one of these had a 95% chance of being the thing that leads to nuclear war, and the other one only has a 5% chance, we could play it smart and say, well, let's fix the one that's more probable. But we don't have those odds. Right? We don't know what's the relative probability of nuclear weapon use arising from accident and misperception and inadvertent escalation versus the relative probability of nuclear use arising from a deliberate attempt to challenge deterrent commitment because it's not seen as credible. We just can't. We don't know where to place our chips on the poker table because we don't know which of these things has a higher probability of being true. So in the paper, the analogy that I give is that I feel like our situation is a bit like being in an airplane and we're flying. And we're flying in a very dense cloud where we can't use visuals to see in front of us. And the instruments have gone down and we're not getting data. And we've heard that there's a mountain range up ahead somewhere, but we're not sure quite where it is. We're not quite sure how tall the mountains are, how wide the range is. The plane's been flying for a while and we haven't crashed, and that's good, right? And that can give us all a lot of comfort, but it doesn't tell us what the danger ahead is. How close are we to the mountains? What direction of flying will crash us into the mountains? And so you can say, well, let's just abandon the plane, like get our parachutes and jump out, but that's risky too, right? So it's a situation in which there's very high risk and very hard ability to determine what would eliminate or mitigate that risk. Okay. In the peer review process for this paper, one of the reviewer comments I got back was, there's nothing unique about nuclear weapons. Uncertainty trade-offs, that's every policy problem that's ever existed. Why is this person going on and on about nukes? So I think that's not right. And so I added some argumentation about that. Right? One of the reasons it's not right is just the stakes are higher. If I don't know, I guess I can't resist being topical at least a little bit, right? If we're wrong about the Russian and Chinese threat to take over Greenland if the United States doesn't occupy it first, the world doesn't end, right? It changes the balance of power a little bit. It affects US relations with NATO, Europe, but the world doesn't end, right? If we get it wrong with nukes, we potentially do risk essentially destroying human civilization. I also think the kind of uncertainty at work is different. There's not a fundamental uncertainty about whether climate change is happening or not, right? We know that it's happening. There's not a fundamental uncertainty about whether artificial intelligence exists and is going to continue to get more powerful, right? We know that that's true, right? So the type of uncertainty about nuclear weapons, is there going to be a nuclear war or not, I think is different in character from the uncertainties that attach to other potential existential threats. And for a lot of other things in the international security domain, we actually do have data, right? We have data on conventional deterrence successes and failures that we can use to sort of learn something, right? We have data on states that did and didn't proliferate with nuclear weapons that we can use to get data on things, right? We don't have data on worlds that didn't experience nuclear war, right? And then with these other things, the interaction between uncertainty and trade-offs isn't necessarily the same. So the example I have here comes from kind of the war on terror period, right? Under the George W. Bush administration, the United States gave itself greatly enhanced surveillance powers that intruded on people's privacy quite a bit, with the idea that this would help us detect potential terrorist threats and reduce the threat of terrorism. Assuming that enough data was made public and that somebody could do the analysis, we're far enough in, 25 years in, that we could probably generate some data saying all of these Patriot Act, et cetera, warrantless surveillance powers we gave ourselves reduced the chances of terrorism by X%, right? And let's say it made a real difference. It really reduced the chances of terrorism. That wouldn't convince some people to support the policy. Some people would say, privacy, civil liberties, they're just more important. And to me, it's worth it taking the risk of terrorism to avoid sacrificing my civil liberties, right? That's not the same thing here, where everybody wants to reduce the chances of nuclear war, and the trade-offs involve which approach is the one that actually successfully reduces the chances of nuclear war. So yes, uncertainty and trade-offs, there's nothing weird or unfamiliar about them. They exist with every decision we ever have to make. But they manifest in ways with nuclear weapons that are really, I think, extra problematic. Okay, nearly to the end. All right. So let me posit a final conclusion here. Let me posit the conclusion that I'm right. If I'm correct about this, what does it mean? Well, one of the weird things about this is I'm not sure I actually change anybody's mind, right? If you are John Mearsheimer, to randomly pick an academic, and you're convinced that nuclear weapons are really great because they make the chances of major conventional war almost zero, and you read this paper, which you probably won't, you probably don't change your mind, right? Because I'm just saying we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know it, right? So if you have strong intuition, strong instincts already, odds are you're going to stick with them. So I think one of the pleas I do want to make based on this paper is, and it kind of cuts against the grain of, I think, how academics are socialized. Let's just be more modest. Let's have a little bit more humility about our claims and not express such confidence that we're absolutely right and we're sure and we know we're right, right? We don't know because we can't get the evidence that would definitively, right, answer these questions. And I think it's also worth thinking about what kind of research agendas might at least give us a little bit more data, right? So interesting war games might do it. Really good historical research where we get much deeper into what happened in the various close calls that happened in the past. Maybe more encouraging of speculative fiction, right? What can we learn from the really interesting science fiction and fantasy writers about the pathways that could lead to nuclear disaster and how to at least imagine them, even if they haven't happened, right, in reality. It also makes sense to look for measures that would have a high chance of reducing nuclear dangers across the different sort of trade-off scenarios, right? Are there things that are sort of good advice, regardless of which view of nuclear strategy you think is correct? I've been thinking a lot about just making sure that there's really good education of leaders and publics alike to make sure that we all stay aware of what happens if nuclear weapons are used, maybe stay aware of human fallibility and Murphy's Law and the sensitivity to know that things can go wrong. And getting people to share that knowledge, right? Anything that brings leaders together to talk. In the paper, I proposed something called nuclear knowledge summits based on the old nuclear security summits, kind of married to the humanitarian consequences initiative, I guess. Like, can we get leaders to sit down and get briefed on, like, hey, this is what happens if there's a nuclear war. This is what we've learned from past cases about, the kinds of close calls that we could have. Finally, my takeaway from this paper is that we can never get the chance of nuclear Armageddon down to zero. And to me, that renews my interest in trying to find some kind of pathway to nuclear abolition. I still am convinced that global zero is the right end outcome to try for. The conditions today are not at all propitious, but it's worth thinking about what are the things that we could do now that would help improve the prospects for moving towards nuclear disarmament at some potential point in the future. And for countries who are convinced that nuclear security contributes significantly to their security, the nuclear deterrence contributes to their security, can we find viable alternatives to nuclear deterrence that would have at least similar levels of, if maybe not equal levels of contributing to security and stability? So I'm going to end there. That's my email if anybody wants to email me with follow-up questions. If you have a really great idea for the paper, I will love to hear it. The paper is actually already published. It came out in a special issue of the Nonproliferation Review that was published late last year. And that's the publisher's website if you want to access a copy. If you can't get it from the publisher, I've got a PDF and I can email it to anybody who asks. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jeff, for the very thought-provoking talk. So we're now going to open the floor for questions. We have about 30 minutes for Q&A. As is the CSEC tradition, we'll start by giving the first good questions to our fellows, to our students, before we open up to everybody else. A bit of a crowd control. One finger means that you have a question, and two finger means a quick follow-up, not a second question in disguise. And please help us all by ending with a question mark. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask you the very first question.
Sure.
That was a pretty thought-provoking talk, right? Your core claim is straightforward, but it's unsettling that we cannot have a justified confidence that nuclear deterrence will continue to prevent nuclear use simply because the probability of nuclear war is fundamentally unknowable. So if strategy is a bet and a gamble, and if luck is what kept us safe so far, then how much luck do you think we have left?
I don't have an ability to answer that. There were weird, quirky things that happened in the context of some of these crises that created some increased risk of nuclear weapons being used. There is to luck, right? Sometimes like a key person in the right place. So what's it? Arkhipov, who was the, I think, second in command on a Soviet nuclear sub in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. Navy was dropping charges into the water to try to force Soviet subs to surface during the quarantine of Cuba, and did not know that some of these subs were armed with nuclear torpedoes. Right? And the quality of Soviet submarine construction in that age was not terribly good. So there was one sub that was in danger of basically failing and killing the crew. And the commander decided that he wanted to respond to the dropping of charges by launching the sub's nuclear torpedoes. And he was talked out of it by another officer on the ship who happened to have been on a different nuclear-powered submarine earlier, where there had been a reactor problem that caused a major release of radioactivity that had killed a number of his crewmates on the ship. And so because of that, he was unusually sensitive to nuclear dangers, right? If he had been deployed on a different Soviet submarine, that commander probably would have launched the nuclear torpedo. So it's luck that that one guy was on that one ship, right? But why was his presence there so important? It was important because he knew something about nuclear dangers, right? What happens if nuclear things start getting set off? So that tells me that we can at least change the odds a little bit, increase the chances that luck breaks good instead of bad, by making sure that everybody knows what Arkhipov knew, right? That, hey, once you start firing these things, all bets are off. Massive numbers of people are killed. Much of the Earth is made radioactive. We can't necessarily know that we can control escalation. So the more people who come from an appropriate knowledge background and an appropriate set of attitudes that are developed because of that knowledge, the better our chances. So we can try to shape our luck, but we can never guarantee that it's going to hold forever.
Thanks, Jeff. Right. Any questions from our students? We'll start with Emily, Elizabeth, Kevin, and then we'll go down the list.
Hi, I'm Emily Tell. I'm a postdoc here at CSEC. I wanted to ask you about the idea that if strategy is a gamble and people base their decisions based on their past experiences, which you acknowledge in the paper by saying that certain people who had experiences with crises no longer are at the helm, so they therefore maybe will be moving forward into more risky territory. So as we go longer and longer without a nuclear war or a serious crisis, and people, do you first of all think that people are making riskier and riskier decisions because of a false sense of certainty? Do we have evidence of that?
Mm-hmm.
And like, does this change your thought experiment? I guess it doesn't really change the thought experiment, but does it change the implications at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that people are behaving in riskier ways now than was true in the past. I might partially set aside India and Pakistan, which do have experience of crisis, and I'm not enough of a South Asia subject matter expert to have a good handle on whether they're getting more cautious or less cautious.
Cautious.
Less cautious. That's my impression from afar. But U.S. and Russia, I think, are definitely getting less cautious, right? And it's when you just look at the kinds of nuclear saber rattling that the Russians have engaged in, in connection with the invasion of Ukraine. And I've had people who have inside knowledge of the Russian system. I've seen them make statements that the people who are surrounding Putin and advising him, they're not the veterans of the Cold War, right? They don't remember 1962 or 1973, and they are very confident in the Russian ability to sort of manipulate risk to their own advantage, and their behavior seems to validate that. And in fact, there have been some public statements by some Russian analysts that I think the problem is that the U.S. But their problem is a credibility problem. It's not that the U.S. The problem is not that the U.S. is not afraid enough of nuclear war as a global problem, but the problem is that the United States is not afraid enough of Russia, right? And Russia's willingness to use nuclear weapons, and hence Russia has to talk tougher and engage in various kinds of signaling in order to restore its credibility vis-a-vis the United States. Maybe I'll take the United States as given at this point. We have a president who doesn't seem to think like other presidents, and there's no reason to think that nuclear weapons is an exception to anything else in this administration.
Kevin.
Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth Good. Very, very quick question. On the slide where you were talking about the different types of data that we can come from, or that we can gather from, and you had a note that was talking about war games with an arrow that says, we should worry. So tell me more.
Yeah. So, there have been a lot of war games. And it's interesting because several years ago, Reed Pauly had a really nice article on international security where he got access to a lot of war games that were run in the government, I think mostly during the Kennedy years, early 1960s. And in all of those war games, people were desperate to avoid nuclear war, and they were all de-escalated, and none of them escalated to the nuclear level. And Reed used that as an argument for sort of the fundamental stability of a sort of mutual assured destruction relationship. But it turns out those aren't the only historical war games, and as more time has gone on, we found out about other ones. So, for example, the Rand Corporation used to run a lot of war games in the 1950s. I'm blanking on the author's name, but there was an article in Texas National Security Review a few years ago. And it turned out that if the games were played by analysts in the social sciences division, they were mostly de-escalated and they didn't end in nuclear war. If they were played by analysts in the math division, they all went to nuclear war. Like the mathematicians, I think, didn't have the sort of historical and sociological knowledge, and they tried to logically calculate who could get an advantage and would ratchet up. Another very famous historical example was from the 1980s, a game called The Proud Prophet, war game that was played by really senior people in the Reagan administration, I think up to the level of the Secretary of Defense, if I'm remembering correctly. The game was designed by Paul Bracken, am I remembering this correctly, at Yale? But they played it over like a 5-day period. It began with like a conflict in Western Europe, and it ended in all-out nuclear war, and I think kind of freaked out some of the people in the Reagan administration. In recent years, academics have discovered that you can sort of run war games in an experimental mode, right? And have people play multiple trials, vary parameters, and so forth. And from the papers I've read, it's almost always the case that in some subset of the trials they run, nuclear weapons end up getting used. It's very rare to sort of have a war game and all its trials with no nuclear weapon use. So yeah, that's what that was referring to. Thank you for asking.
Evelyn, please introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, please.
Kevin Bustamante, postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. So thank you for the talk. I'm curious to know, how do you think about the academic balance between explaining history versus sort of the ethics of it all, right? So like, if you're one of these people that says the nuclear revolution is bunk, how do you think about this sort of balance between, okay, maybe this is the way policymakers thought about it at the time, maybe this is what simulations say is achievable today, versus actually we should not condone this at all?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question, Kevin. I'm not sure I've got a good answer. There's an incentive structure in the academic profession, and at least in the United States. It's a publisher perish world, and your citations matter, and you improve your odds of getting published and getting a lot of attention to your work and getting cited a lot if you go out on a limb and you make yourself really provocative. And so I think that has encouraged some of my peers in the profession to write things that may be more outlandish than what they believe in private. And I worry about that because I think it does sometimes affect the real world of policy in ways that have undesirable policy implications. So, I wish that we thought more about ethics in our profession and what to do in our research and publishing and giving briefings. I want to be careful here, right? I'm not, many of these people are friends, and I don't want to give the implication that they have bad intentions in what they do. I think they more or less believe what they say. And because of the uncertainties involved, different people can look at the same problem and reach different conclusions. But I'd rather have no influence than have bad influence on policy, but I think that's not the incentive structure of the field. And so I think I do wish that we thought more about ethics in our profession.
Shreya, and then Anna.
Thanks, Professor Knopf. I'm Shreya Lad, Scott's research assistant. I have a two-pronged question on one, for your argument, who is your audience? And I mean this in the sense of within the nuclear order of nuclear weapon states, of which there are peers, and then there are smaller states, there are proliferators and would-be proliferators, and then non-nuclear weapon states. Who is the onus on to make a difference here, and who is your plea addressing? And then second, I'm curious, when you say that global zero is the goal eventually, what would that look like? And I know this is something you list in your implications for us to think about, but I'm wondering if you have a vision of that post-disarmament world, what replaces nuclear weapons? Because Reagan attempted to have conventional missile defense replace that, and we all know how that ended up. And Schelling writes about how the first person to proliferate and develop nuclear weapons in a world post-disarmament will not have no taboo not to use them. So yeah, just wondering what your vision
of that
looks
both
like.
Great questions. The audience is sort of everyone. I'm hoping, the non-proliferation review is not, it's not foreign affairs. I have no idea if anybody in Washington will read it. But I hope that policymakers in nuclear armed states will become aware of the argument and its implications. The audience is my fellow academics, right? The claim to be just more modest. I think too many people have too much. It kind of dovetails with my last answer. I think too many people sort of see too much value in being overly bold and provocative, and I'd kind of like to cultivate a sense of more humility in our claims. I'm hoping certain parts of the public will see it and be motivated to want to be actively involved and generate more public pressure around these issues. Another somewhat obscure thing that I wrote and published, it's a chapter in an edited volume on the future of global governance, and I wandered off the reservation and wrote about how we avoid nuclear war, which doesn't really fit the rest of the volume, but when I think about like how did we get through the last 80 years without a nuclear war, right? I think to me, it's a combination of two things, right? One, there's a kind of underlying psychology on the part of leaders. They know enough about what a nuclear war would look like that they're cautious and afraid of it, combined with some hope that this isn't inevitable, and with the right kinds of diplomacy and institutions, we can keep things safe. Not all leaders have that mindset. So, the other factor is sort of mobilized public opinion and people creating social pressures on people not to go overboard with nuclear threats and nuclear buildup. So I think you need a sort of a two-track thing that engages both leaders and publics. And I hope that the subject matter expert field can disseminate knowledge and ideas that will encourage thoughtfulness on the parts of those other two audiences. I might just punt on your second question. To get to nuclear deterrence, right, you have to have enough sense that we can avoid major conventional wars even without nuclear weapons, some level of trust, some level of verification, some expectation of enforcement. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard to get there. And I think anything that does get us there is going to require a little bit of a leap of faith that we're doing the right thing despite the risks.
Yes, Anna next.
Thank you so much. I'm Anna Ford. I'm also a postdoc here. Really great talk. I wanted to push you a little bit on, you're talking about, or towards the end you said, nuclear weapons are unique in some sense. But I was wondering, what about compounding risks or uncertainties? So not only looking at nuclear weapons as a siloed uncertainty or existential risk, but taking other things into consideration, like AI, like other things that could potentially even further this radical uncertainty, and how you think about that in your work.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a good point. If I were to follow up on this, that would be one potential, I think, domain for future research. There's a lot of other people who spent a lot more time already thinking about some of these issues than me, so I'm a little bit reluctant. I might just yield the floor to them. I had a nice Zoom call conversation not too long ago with Benoit Pelopidis. I know Marty knows him well, and then some other people here. He's writing something about that right now, and he's a good big picture thinker. So I might say, wait for Benoit's next piece to come out. But he's one of several people who are thinking about a polycrisis. I'm not quite sure what the term du jour is, but what do you do in a world where all these things are happening simultaneously and interacting with each other and compounding with each other? But I think you're right that like these issues don't exist in isolation, and the way in which they collide into each other creates more uncertainties and creates more dangers.
The next chapter. We have Scott Sagan, Dippin, and then Tom.
Scott Sagan, the director here. I was surprised that you, in guessing what needs to be done now, we're talking so much about war games and surveys and all the things that I think are really worthy. But given your past research, I would have thought you would have wanted more deep research on nuclear crises. After all, Putin, I think, at least according to reports of the U.S. intelligence, had a 50-50 chance of using nuclear weapons in the fall of 2022. We know that President Trump was given military options against North Korea in 2017 for a preventive strike. And there have been the many crises in South Asia. So how would you recommend we go about studying nuclear history when it's so new and so little of the information is available? It took many years to understand the declassified documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we need to study these more recent crises now without the benefit of all the documents. How should we do that?
Thank you, Scott. I am literally thinking of that as a potential next project. So if I get around to writing a grant proposal, maybe I'll hint that you should be one of the referees whether to fund it. I think we do. I'll answer in two parts. I mean, one, we need to keep studying everything we can learn about the nuclear crises that have happened, both the more historical ones and the more recent ones. In part because I think the empirical focus hasn't been entirely in the right place. Right? So it's usually sort of, bargaining behavior and who makes what moves to signal what, and what does this tell us about sort of crisis bargaining and coercive bargaining, right? Or close calls and near accidents, and what can we take away about how close we came or didn't come. And I'd like to look more at like what did leaders understand about the kinds of risks they were taking? Like, how familiar were they with, how well briefed were they on what happens if we use nuclear weapons? How confident were they that escalation could be controlled? Right? I remember the very famous message that Khrushchev sent at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he has this very vivid metaphor, speaking to President Kennedy, like, we're two people pulling on two ends of a rope with a knot in the middle. And before the knot becomes so tight that we can't untie it, let's stop both tugging on the two ends of the rope, right? Is that a common way that leaders think when they enter into nuclear crisis? Or was Khrushchev unusual in having that sensitivity to the danger that he was running? So I would love to look at what you can find in the historical record about how the different leaders and top advisors thought, and how common that kind of Khrushchevian, thinking was. For the more recent crises, obviously, there's nothing, there's not going to be any declassified documents to look at. So, you would probably have to try to do interviews where you can, and look at contemporary journalistic reporting and try to figure out which reporters maybe had access to sources that were, firsthand sources. But I do think that we've come closer than many people realize in some of these recent crises. I talked this morning with Dennis, who has good contacts in the Russian government, and was telling me that people were telling him in fall 2022, like, buy your plane tickets now and move before the worst happens. So I think it was serious.
You have two fingers from.
I just wanted to say on the India-Pakistan stuff, so I'm one of the U.S. India fellows here at CSAC,
Okay.
and I do think that there might be a role for the U.S. and allies to play in providing more information about what's going on in the South Asian crises. They obviously know a lot about what's going on. There are reports, that think like there were nuclear threats made, but none of this information is public. And like, while this was happening, in real time, the most recent crisis, half of Twitter was just talking about the Pope being, selected, and there's like imminent nuclear war. And my point is just simply that even in other parts of the world, like U.S. retrenchment has been so prominent, and the role of the United States and its allies in preventing nuclear war in other places and playing the crisis manager role has been declining. And overall, I don't think people in Washington, even in the amount of engagement I saw in the last India-Pakistan crisis, was extremely limited. So I think, I guess I just wanted to say that this is not just something that we should be focusing on with like the great powers, but probably the biggest flashpoint, in my opinion, is India-Pakistan, and we're paying increasingly less attention to it. So I just had to.
My understanding was that Marco Rubio and some of the administration folks did get in contact.
Eventually,
yeah.
But my understanding is that was because Pakistan reached out.
Oh, interesting. I'd love to talk more.
We have Dipen next.
There's somebody in the back. I don't know if you can see.
Go through the list. There's 7 more people wanting to.
Okay. I'll keep my answers short.
Hi, I'm Dipin. I'm one of the fellows here, and just talking about actually nuclear crises and the world we live in now. One thing that we can, while I totally buy your argument about a nuclear peace over the past 8 decades or so. One thing that we can see empirically going up is the attacks on nuclear sites and facilities, and that is more measurable than a lot of the risks that we talked about right now, right? So to what extent can we use that as a proxy? So can we conclude in some way that the fact that these strikes are going up are putting us in more of a risk world instead of an uncertainty world? Because maybe that's one way to signal that I know where your nuclear weapons are, and that's kind of an off-ramp to escalation. Or can it be, putting us in the risk world, but in an increased probability of war way, in that countries that are the ones that are attacked, the countries whose nuclear facilities are attacked, see it as provocation and then as an invitation to kind of attack.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I don't think it changes the uncertainty because Israel and the U.S. striking Iran, or the Ukrainians hitting the Russian bomber base. Right, nobody's actually using a nuclear weapon, right? And so it tells you the kinds of behaviors that are possible in a nuclear world, and that we know that those behaviors are to some degree risky. But I think we still don't know what's the likelihood that any of those triggers an escalation that crosses the nuclear threshold. I don't think we can calculate that. What we can say is in a world where there are nuclear weapons, one of the incentives that countries face is to attack preemptively, and that carries its own set of risks with it.
We have Tom, Steve Pfeiffer, and Jim, and then we still have a gentleman at the back and 2 gentlemen here. So let's go with Tom first.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. Tom Danbaum, I joined the faculty here this summer. So just quickly, a couple of points, but the first one on this question of the ethics of the profession. One of the things we know in law is that most lawyers believe their clients' arguments. They believe their clients to be correct. So it's not so much that they're cynically making arguments with which they disagree because the profession incentivizes it. It's that the profession incentivizes them to actually believe those arguments. And so they think they are faithfully reflecting the best arguments by the time they're ultimately making them. And if that's true, then appealing to the ethics of political scientists or others involved in this discourse to be more modest in their claims is unlikely to be effective insofar as they're not self-consciously being immodest. They're incentivized to be immodest, and then they believe those immodest claims and think, this is the right claim. It's not that I'm exaggerating my claim because the profession incentivizes me to. I'm making the correct claim. It's just that my determination that that's the correct claim is incentivized by the profession. So the solution then would have to come at the level of changing the incentives rather than appealing to the practitioners to be less immodest in their claims. At least that's the way I would think about that issue. The second question, or the real question, is related to the ambition for global zero. So let's assume that that's the correct ultimate goal. But as you mentioned, that it's not currently a political climate that's propitious for achieving that goal. So what are the short-term and medium-term goals that one should adopt if one has that longer-term goal? And how would those short-term and medium-term goals themselves change the parameters that affect the uncertainty that's driving the argument?
I'll just take your first point. That you may be right, and I don't have a sort of response to it. If you're right, then nothing's going to change in the way people write. The second one, in my mind, I think of this as 2 timelines, right? So the long-term timeline for me ideally will lead to some effective form of nuclear disarmament that can be sustained and doesn't inadvertently make the world worse. But that's some number of years or decades or centuries in the future, right? And so the short to medium term timeline is like, how do we survive in a world where nuclear weapons still exist and multiple states have nuclear arsenals? And for me, the goal has to be to identify as many things as possible that create inhibitions to nuclear threats and nuclear use. So that's where some of the nuclear knowledge, make sure everybody's really aware, comes in. That's why I think it's still worth trying to revive arms control, preserve nonproliferation, maintain as many of the institutional roadblocks as you can. um, um, you know, um, trying to encourage the right kinds of civil-military relations, so there are checks and balances within countries. There is a little bit of a moral hazard danger there, where if you make it seem like it's safe to live in a world with nuclear weapons, you reduce the motivations to move to disarmament. But to me, that's a trade-off worth making. Let's try to live for as long as we can with nuclear weapons in hopes that we get to the world where we know we can move to get rid of them. So, in my own thinking, I am less thinking about how do we get to nuclear disarmament and more thinking about how do we reinforce inhibitions to nuclear use in the short term.
Since we only have 1 minute left, is it okay if we combine the two questions from Steve and Jim before we yield it back to you?
Okay, Steve Pfeiffer, affiliate here at CSAC. Great talk, Jeff. When I was in government, I had a colleague who spent a lot of time thinking about nuclear deterrence. And he once made the observation, he said, the decision on nuclear use at the end of the day gets made by an individual with imperfect information, under time pressure, great stress. And he went on to suggest that that decision is going to depend much more on how that individual is wired than doctrine, strategy, pre-planned war plans. And so I suggest, how Donald Trump reacts is going to be different from Barack Obama or for Scott Sagan or for you. Doesn't that mean that the idea of kind of coming up with a predictable theory of nuclear deterrence ultimately is not going to be soluble?
Yes. So yes, two things. So one, yes, because individual decision makers matter, there's always going to be some level of uncertainty. And because individual decision makers matter, that's a reason to make sure they're as well briefed and educated as possible, so that if they find themselves in that moment of decision, their first instinct is to look for the exit ramp rather than to push the button.
This phone says 1:15, so I'll ask it afterwards.
Apologize that we did not get to all the questions today. Clearly, this was a very thought-provoking talk. Please join me in thanking Jeffrey for
Thank you, everybody. You reaffirmed my faith in the value of coming up to talk at CSAC. It's always a great experience to give a talk here.